You have eaten food that came from Houston and never even known it. That plate of sizzling fajitas at your favorite Mexican restaurant? The crawfish swimming in butter and garlic that made you question everything you ever knew about shellfish? The soft pastry you grabbed from a Texas gas station before a long morning drive? Houston did not just feed itself. Houston fed the world. This city on the Gulf Coast, shaped by generations of immigrants from Mexico, Vietnam, Czechoslovakia, and Louisiana, shaped by oil wealth and Gulf breezes and a bottomless appetite for bold flavors, has given American food culture more than it ever gets credit for. The food writers fly to Austin, the tourists flock to San Antonio, and Houston quietly goes on inventing dishes that the rest of the country eats for decades without knowing the origin. Today, we are counting down 10 foods that were invented, transformed, or made famous right here in Houston, Texas. Some of these will shock you. Of these will shock. Every single one will make you hungry. At number 10, we start with something sweet, simple, and deeply Texan. The year was 1936, and Lawrence Shipley Sr. opened a small donut shop in Houston with one guiding principle. Fresh donuts made daily, sold cheap, available to everyone. He was not trying to build an empire, he was trying to feed a city. What he created instead was a Texas institution that has outlasted empires, recessions, and the rise of every national chain that ever tried to take his customers. Shipley Donuts became the donut of Houston the way no national brand ever could, because it was born here, stayed here, and understood what people in this city actually wanted. The glazed donut at Shipley's is not complicated. Hot oil, fresh dough, a waterfall of glaze that pools and sets into that thin, crackled shell that shatters slightly when you bite through it. The inside pulls apart soft and warm, yeasty and light in a way that only works when the donut was made a few hours ago and not a few days ago. That is the Shipley difference. Freshness was never a marketing claim. It was a survival strategy. If you did not sell them fresh, you had nothing worth selling. Lawrence Shipley Jr. later expanded the concept across the Gulf Coast, but Houston remained the heartbeat. More than 80 locations in the Houston area alone. Generations of families who grew up stopping at Shipley's after church on Sunday, after soccer practice, after late-night shifts, after nothing in particular, because sometimes a hot glazed donut at midnight is all the reason you need. The Kolash connection came later, a beautiful Texan evolution we will get to shortly. But the donut itself, that hot glazed original, started right here in Houston in 1936. No other city can claim it. No national chain has ever replicated what happens when a Shipley donut comes out of the fryer, and you are standing close enough to feel the heat. Krispy Kreme tried. Nobody in Houston was fooled. Some things cannot be franchised into existence. At number 9, we go back even further to the early 20th century, when Houston's Mexican-American community began cooking something that did not exist anywhere else on Earth. The Tex-Mex combination plate. Not Mexican food, not American food. Something entirely its own. A plate that arrived at your table like a declaration. Enchiladas, tamales, rice, and refried beans, all arranged together, all built for the Texas appetite. Restaurants like Molina's, which opened in Houston in 1941, became the temples where the combination plate was codified and served to generations of Houstonians who never thought to question why this was the most natural thing in the world to put on a single plate. 90 years later, Molina's is still serving the same plates, the same recipes, in the same building. You sit down, you order the combination, and what arrives is something that has fed Houston through every decade of its existence. The enchilada sauce at a great Tex-Mex spot is not mild, not timid, not a suggestion. It is a deep red built from dried chiles, tomatoes, and cumin, and something older than any written recipe. Chefs at places like Molina's and El Real Tex-Mex will tell you that the sauce is everything. You can have the best masa in the world, and the freshest beef and the sharpest cheddar, and if the sauce is not right, the plate fails. Houston took that seriously from the beginning. The tamale wrapped in corn husks and steamed until the masa becomes silky. The beans cooked slow with lard and salt until they achieve that creaminess that no shortcut ever replicates. The rice dry and loose and orange red with tomato. All of it together on one plate that feeds you like it means it. Houston's Tex-Mex combination plate spread to every Mexican restaurant that followed. At number 8, we move to the water. Houston sits close enough to the Gulf of Mexico that the seafood culture runs through everything here. And out of that proximity came something specific to this city and the Creole communities that shaped it. The Gulf Coast seafood gumbo. Louisiana will tell you gumbo belongs to them, and they are not wrong about the origins. But what happened to gumbo when it crossed into Houston was its own transformation. The Creole and Cajun communities that settled in Houston's 5th Ward and the East End brought their roux knowledge, their file powder, their trinity of onions, celery, and bell pepper. But they also had access to Gulf shrimp, blue crabs, Gulf oysters, and drumfish in quantities that changed what gumbo could become. Houston's version got bigger, bolder, loaded with shellfish in ways that even Louisiana sometimes acknowledged. The dark roux that Houston pitmasters and home cooks developed is particular. You stand at a cast iron pot and you stir, and you keep stirring, and the flour and fat go from pale to golden to amber, to a color that food writers struggle to describe, and locals just call chocolate. That roux is the backbone of everything. Get it wrong and no amount of seafood saves the pot. Get it right, and the gumbo that builds on top of it becomes something that cannot be reduced to a recipe. Restaurants in Houston's 3rd Ward and the East End serve this gumbo to generations of workers, to families gathering after church, to anyone who needed feeding. Thelma's Kitchen, Frenchie's Chicken, and 100 smaller neighborhood spots kept this tradition alive across decades when food critics were not paying attention. The Gulf Coast seafood gumbo is Houston's inheritance from the Gulf and from the communities who knew exactly what to do with it. At number 7, we arrive at something that is genuinely and uniquely Texan, and more specifically, uniquely Houston. The savory breakfast kolache. Czech immigrants began arriving in Central Texas in the 1850s, bringing with them a pastry tradition built around sweet fillings. Fruit, cheese, poppy seed. These were proper kolaches, round and soft and sweet, and they became part of the Texas landscape through generations of Czech communities, farming the hill country and the Brazos River Valley. Then something happened in Houston. The Czech bakery tradition hit the Gulf Coast city with its enormous appetite, its oil field workers, its overnight shift laborers, its highway driving culture, and the sweet kolache became something different. Someone put sausage inside, then jalapeno and cheese, then eggs and bacon. The savory breakfast kolache was born, a hot, soft pastry stuffed with things that had no business being inside a Central European pastry, and tasting absolutely perfect because of it. Shipley's started selling them. The Houston Kolache Factory built an entire business model around them. Morning drive-thrus across the metro began moving thousands of them before the sun was fully up. Czech purists sometimes object to calling the savory version a kolache at all, insisting the correct term is klobasnek. But in Houston, nobody calls them that. You walk up to the counter, you say 3 sausage kolaches and a glazed donut, and everyone understands exactly what you mean. The soft, yeasty dough wrapped around a link of smoky sausage, the edges sealed, the whole thing baked until golden and handed to you still warm. That is a Houston breakfast. That is how Houston took a century-old immigrant tradition, gave it a sausage filling and a jalapeno, and made it entirely its own. Central Texas brought the pastry. Houston decided what went inside. At number 6, we talk about smoke and patience and a cut of beef that Houston made famous before the rest of the world caught up. The chopped beef sandwich. Texas BBQ gets written about constantly, and usually the conversation centers on Austin, or Lockhart, or the legendary Central Texas belt where brisket rules and the smoke rings are measured in centimeters. But Houston has its own BBQ identity, and at the center of it sits the chopped beef sandwich. While Central Texas was obsessing over perfectly sliced brisket with perfect bark, Houston pitmasters were doing something different. They were taking the sections of the brisket that were too fatty or too lean or too irregular to plate cleanly, and they were chopping them together into a pile of meat that was frankly more interesting than a perfect slice. Chopped beef catches more smoke in its irregular surfaces, It absorbs the sauce differently. It eats with more texture variation in every bite. Wrapped in plain white bread or served on a bun with a slick of tangy sauce, a Houston chopped beef sandwich is one of the great American sandwiches. Full stop. Pizzatola's BBQ has been making this case in Houston since 1935. Burns BBQ in the 3rd Ward became legendary for a product built on hickory smoke and decades of refinement. The Houston BBQ scene that emerged from these roots became a genuine alternative to the Central Texas model. Not lesser, just different. More sauced, more chopped. More shaped by the African-American pitmasters who built it. Houston's chopped beef sandwich is the city's contribution to the BBQ canon, and it deserves to be named out loud. The next time someone tells you Austin invented Texas BBQ, ask them if they have ever eaten at Pizzatola's. The conversation changes after that. At number 5, we turn to a sandwich that came from New Orleans and never fully left the Gulf Coast. The po' boy arrived in Houston through the same Creole and Cajun migration routes that brought the gumbo tradition, and Houston did with it what Houston does with everything it adopts. It absorbed it, adapted it, and made something that the original city of origin eventually had to acknowledge. The Houston Gulf Shrimp Po' Boy became its own distinct creation because the shrimp are different here. Gulf brown shrimp pulled from nearby waters, fried at temperatures that create a crust that shatters at first contact. Piled onto French bread, dressed with a remoulade that Houston po' boy shops have been quietly refining for decades. Treebeards in downtown Houston, which opened in 1978, became famous for a Gulf shrimp po' boy that regulars would travel across the city to eat on a Friday. The shrimp were fat and fresh, and the bread was right, and the sauce was made in-house, and the combination was honest. Floyd's Cajun Seafood built their entire brand around similar principles. What distinguishes the Houston po' boy from its New Orleans cousin is the shrimp sourcing, and what that freshness does to the final sandwich. A po' boy built on Gulf Coast. Brown shrimp caught within days carries a sweetness and snap that frozen shrimp cannot replicate under any circumstances. Houston restaurants built supply chains directly to Gulf docks before that was fashionable, before terms like farm to table existed, simply because the fish house was 45 minutes down the highway, and fresh was obvious. Houston's Gulf Shrimp Po' Boy is the result of proximity, community, and a city that knew what was swimming in the water nearby. At number 4, we arrive at something that is simultaneously one of the most beloved foods in America and one of the most underrated inventions in culinary history. Queso, not the authentic Mexican cheese preparations that inspired it. The Tex-Mex queso, the molten, running, golden dip that arrives in a cast iron bowl at the beginning of a meal and disappears before the tortillas run out. The queso that Texans cannot stop eating, and the rest of America discovered and immediately understood was not optional. This was a Houston and San Antonio invention, built in Tex-Mex kitchens over decades of quiet experimentation. The original versions at places like Molina's in Houston used processed American cheese melted into a base of tomatoes and chilies, and they were unapologetic about it. The processed cheese created a stability that natural cheeses struggled to maintain under heat. It stayed fluid, stayed smooth, stayed scoopable across an entire meal. Later versions added roasted poblanos, pickled jalapenos, caramelized onions, Mexican chorizo crumbled and stirred in. The queso at Hugo's in Houston, built by Hugo Ortega, who came to this city from Oaxaca and became one of its most important chefs, elevated the form into something that food critics studied seriously. But the foundation was the humble Tex-Mex bowl at neighborhood restaurants across Houston's southwest quadrant, where Mexican-American home cooks had been perfecting the formula for 3 generations before anyone started writing about it. When food writers in New York discovered queso in the early 2000s and treated it as a novelty, Houston had already been refining it for 50 years. The chip goes in. The queso coats it. You burn your tongue because you cannot wait. That is Houston. That has always been Houston. And if you have ever eaten queso anywhere in America and thought it was the restaurant's own recipe, understand that they learned it from a city that spent 50 years getting it exactly right before anyone was watching. At number 3, we encounter one of Houston's most remarkable food stories, one that begins with displacement and ends with invention. In the years following 1975, Houston received one of the largest waves of Vietnamese refugees anywhere in the United States. These families arrived with almost nothing and built communities in Houston's southwest side, in Aliff, in Bel Air, along Bel Air Boulevard, which eventually became known as the city's Vietnamese corridor. Within a generation, these communities had built a food culture that rivaled anything in Southeast Asia for authenticity and began producing original creations that could only happen in Houston. The Vietnamese sandwich, the banh mi, was already a fusion food before it arrived here. French baguette from the colonial period, filled with Vietnamese prepared meats, pickled vegetables, fresh herbs, and chili. When that tradition landed in Houston, it met the Texas pantry. It met jalapenos so fresh they still sweat. It met Gulf shrimp that local Vietnamese restaurants began incorporating into their fillings. It met the Tejano flavor profile that had been seasoning Houston cooking for generations. Shops along Bel Air began producing banh mi variations that Saigon had never imagined. Grilled pork marinated with lemongrass and just enough heat. Shrimp fillings dressed with a sauce that crossed Vietnamese fish sauce with Texas hot sauce in ways that should not work and absolutely do. Vietnamese bakeries in Houston developed their own baguettes, slightly softer, built for Gulf Coast humidity. What emerged is something the food world is still catching up to. Not Vietnamese food, not Tex-Mex, Houston Vietnamese food, a cuisine that exists only in this city and belongs entirely to the families who built it here. At number 2, we have one of the great accidental inventions of American food, a dish that no one planned, that arrived from the collision of two specific cultures in one specific city, and that is now spread to restaurants across the country without those restaurants ever quite understanding where it came from. Viet Cajun crawfish. Houston has always had crawfish. The Cajun and Creole communities that settled here brought their boiling tradition with them. Those massive outdoor pots of heavily seasoned water and live crawfish dumped in by the sack. The classic spring boil meant newspapers spread on tables, crawfish piled high, cold beer, and the satisfying labor of peeling and eating for hours. Vietnamese Houstonians encountered this tradition and found it deeply familiar. Shellfish and communal eating and labor-intensive meals with your hands mapped onto their own food culture in ways that felt natural immediately. Then they started cooking the crawfish differently. They took the boiled crustaceans and finished them in the wok, in a sauce built from butter and garlic and their own arsenal of Asian aromatics. Lemongrass, ginger, fish sauce, Louisiana hot sauce. The result was something that changed what crawfish could be. The sauce clung to the shells and found its way inside. Every bite brought butter and garlic and something brighter and more complex than any traditional Cajun boil had achieved before. Crawfish and noodles on Bel Air Boulevard became the restaurant most associated with this creation. Chef Trong Nguyen's kitchen produced a version that drew lines around the block and articles in national food publications. But crawfish and noodles was not alone. Dozens of Vietnamese restaurants across Houston's southwest side developed their own versions. The Viet Cajun crawfish was a Houston invention, made by Houston Vietnamese cooks, built for Houston appetites, and it changed American crawfish culture in ways that are still unfolding. Food writers in New York and Los Angeles eventually found it and called it a trend. In Houston, it was never a trend. It was dinner, every spring, the way it has always been, just with better sauce than anyone had managed before. At number 1, we arrive at the food that changed American dining more than almost any other single invention of the 20th century, the fajita, and its origin story runs directly through a restaurant on Navigation Street in Houston's East End. Ninfa Lorenzo opened Ninfa's on Navigation in 1973 with $40 in savings, a small kitchen, and a recipe built on skirt steak that was then considered one of the least valuable cuts of beef available. Skirt steak was the diaphragm muscle of the cow, cheap because it was tough, available because butchers did not know quite what to do with it at scale. Ninfa Lorenzo knew exactly what to do with it. She marinated it, she grilled it, she sliced it thin against the grain, and she served it in soft flour tortillas she made in her own kitchen. She called them tacos al carbon. The name that stuck was something else. Fajita comes from the Spanish word for belt or girdle, a reference to the strip of skirt steak itself. When the platter arrived at the table with that skirt steak sizzling audibly, the sound preceding the smell preceding the sight of caramelized meat with charred edges and vapor you could feel on your face, something happened to diners at Ninfa's that had not happened at many restaurants before. The sizzling platter created theater, the experience of a dish arriving at your table performing. Ninfa's on Navigation became famous overnight. Lines stretched out the door. Houston discovered something it had not known it needed. Then Texas discovered it, then the country discovered it, and today there is not a Mexican restaurant in America that does not have fajitas on the menu. Every single one traces back to $40, and a woman on Navigation Street who understood what skirt steak could become if you treated it right. Mama Ninfa passed away in 2001, but the original restaurant on Navigation still stands, still serves the dish she invented, still has a line on weekends. Houston gave the world the fajita. That is a legacy that will outlast everything else on this list. 10 foods, 1 city, and a culinary legacy that America eats every day without knowing the address it came from. Houston does not always get the food credit it deserves. It is not as mythologized as New Orleans. It is not as written about as New York. But put a plate of Ninfa's fajitas in front of anyone, let them taste Viet Cajun crawfish for the first time, hand them a hot glazed donut from Shipley's at 7 in the morning, and the truth becomes obvious. Houston feeds people. It always has. The city built something real here, built it out of immigration and ambition and access to the Gulf, and the particular genius that emerges when cultures cook side by side for long enough. Drop a comment and tell us which of these 10 you have actually eaten. And if you have never been to Houston, you now have a list. The city is waiting. The food is ready. Go eat.